It was my first year of university, a new chapter, a chance to reinvent myself. Everything about the campus buzzed with excitement. After unpacking my life into the small dorm room that would be my home for the year, I waved goodbye to my family and finally sat down to breathe. For the first time, it hit me. I was on my own. Later that evening, my new roommate arrived. The moment Dale walked in, I knew something was off. His clothes were rumpled, his posture slouched, and his eyes darted around the room as if searching for something. I stood up, extended my hand, and said, "Hey, I'm Dan." He stared at my hand like it was a foreign object. After a painfully awkward pause, he chuckled under his breath and finally shook it. His grip was limp, clammy, and uncomfortable, like shaking hands with a wet fish. "What's your name?" I asked, after he failed to introduce himself. "Dale," he mumbled, barely audible. I tried to make small talk, asking him about where he was from, his major, and if he was excited about starting college. Every answer was short: yes, no, or sometimes a nervous laugh. Within minutes, the conversation died, and we both sat on our beds in silence. Laptops open, not a word spoken. I stared at the blank walls of the room, thinking, this guy is weird. By the end of the first hour, I was already contemplating how to switch roommates. Anyone would be better than Dale, I thought. But little did I know, Dale wasn't just awkward. He was something else entirely. That night, I explored campus, met some students on my floor, and soaked in the excitement of orientation week. When I returned to the dorm, Dale hadn't moved an inch. He was still hunched over his laptop, its cold glow casting eerie shadows on his pale face. "What's up, Dale?" I asked. He didn't even look up, no response. I shook my head and decided to call it a night. Sliding under my sheets, I turned off my bedside lamp. Dale's keyboard clattered softly in the darkness. Minutes stretched into hours, and the sound became rhythmic, like an ominous metronome. My irritation grew until, at last, the clacking stopped. I glanced at the clock. 3:04 a.m. Dale finally shut his laptop. Relieved, I closed my eyes and quickly drifted off, only to wake up less than an hour later. Something felt off. The room was dimly lit, faint moonlight streaming through the blinds that I was sure I'd closed earlier. Groggy, I sat up and rubbed my eyes, trying to adjust to the gloom. That's when I saw him. Dale was sitting on the edge of his bed, his face turned toward me. He wasn't moving. He wasn't blinking. He was just staring. "Dale, what the hell are you doing?" I croaked, my voice hoarse with sleep. He didn't answer immediately. Then, in a low whisper, he said, "Sorry." Without another word, he lay down and pulled the covers over himself. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, my mind racing. What was he doing? Watching me? Why? The next morning, Dale was gone when I woke up. It was the first time I'd seen him leave the room. Part of me was relieved. Maybe he was just different. But then, orientation brought another strange encounter. As my group passed the campus gardens, I overheard two students ahead of me whispering, "What's that guy doing in there?" I followed their gaze and froze. There, crouched in the dirt, was Dale. His fingers were tracing the bark of a tree, his movements deliberate, almost reverent. He didn't seem to care or notice that people were staring. I kept walking, trying to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. But when I got back to the dorm later that evening, my unease deepened. The moment I opened my laptop, I knew something was wrong. Files and folders I hadn't touched were open. Emails I hadn't read were marked as read. My privacy had been invaded. "Dale," I said, my voice tight. "Did you go through my stuff?" He froze for a moment, then blurted, "No." His voice was loud, defensive, and far too quick. He didn't even let me finish the question. I didn't press further. What could I do? I didn't trust him, but I didn't want to escalate things. That night, I caught him again, this time rummaging through my bag. "What are you doing?" I demanded, flipping on the light. He blinked up at me, his expression blank. "I think you have my toothbrush," he said flatly. It was a terrible lie, but I didn't push him. I just wanted out. Thankfully, the university had found me a new roommate. The next day, I moved into a new dorm. My new roommate, Mark, was quiet but friendly, light years better than Dale. For the first time, I felt like I could relax. That evening, Mark and I turned off the lights and went to bed after a casual conversation. But once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just nerves. Then I heard it, a faint, irregular clicking sound. I held my breath, trying to place the noise. It wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from the door. Quietly, I crept toward it. Peeking through the peephole, I felt my stomach drop. Someone was on the other side of the door. I could only see the top of their head. The rest was obscured by the angle. The clicking sound was coming from the doorknob, rattling softly, as if someone was trying to pick the lock. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed campus security, whispering my location and the situation. They arrived within minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. When I heard the voices of the officers in the hallway, I finally felt safe enough to open the door. And there he was, Dale. He stood there, handcuffed, his face as blank as ever. He didn't struggle or shout. He just stared at the ground, as if he didn't care what happened next. The officers took him away. I explained everything, how he'd been my roommate, how he'd gone through my things, and now this. I never saw Dale again. Some said he was expelled, others thought he'd been transferred. I didn't care, I just wanted him gone. The rest of my time at university was relatively normal, but the memory of Dale lingered. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still wake up to the sound of faint clicking, only to realize it's my imagination. Or is it? It was the first week of my freshman year at the University of Iowa, and I was still adjusting to everything. The campus, the classes, and especially my new roommate, Mark. Mark was determined to rush a fraternity, and with Rush Week just around the corner, the parties had already begun. I had no real interest in joining a frat, but when Mark asked me to go to one of the parties with him, I agreed. After all, this was a party school, and I wasn't about to miss out on the experience. Mark had a plan. Hit up one of the lower-ranked, almost underground frats on Thursday night as a backup option, and then move on to the better houses over the weekend. I thought the logic was sound, though I didn't have high expectations for the night. The frat house we were headed to was way off campus, in a sketchier part of downtown. When we pulled up, I had to double-check that we were at the right place. The house was a decrepit corner lot, with peeling paint and broken blinds. The kind of place that looked like it was one strong wind away from collapsing. If it weren't for the thumping music and the cars packed into the driveway and street, I'd have thought we were lost. The door swung open to reveal a short, chubby guy with sweat-soaked armpits and a solo cup in hand. "Come on in," he shouted over the music, waving us inside with an enthusiastic grin. The smell hit me first, stale beer, sweat, and a hint of something burnt. The living room was dimly lit, packed with at least 50 sweaty guys. I only spotted 2 girls in the entire room, and neither seemed remotely interested in mingling. Mark dove right into the crowd, chatting with anyone who would listen, but I felt out of place. I grabbed one of the cheap beers they were serving, and tried to make small talk with a guy who barely spoke English. It was awkward, to say the least. The heat in the room was unbearable, and within 20 minutes I was ready to leave. I nudged Mark, signaling that I wanted to go, but the crowd by the door made it awkward to leave so soon. Resigned, I grabbed another beer, hoping it would make the situation more tolerable. I downed 5 cups before I felt even a slight buzz. That's when a heavy-set guy approached me, holding a tiny bottle of liquor. "Here," he said, smirking. "This'll get you shit-faced." I chuckled awkwardly and accepted the bottle, hoping he'd leave me alone. But instead of walking away, he stayed, watching me. His eyes were fixed on me, expectant. I felt the pressure to take a sip. So I did. The liquid burned going down, but I swallowed it quickly and thanked him, trying to excuse myself. He wasn't having it. Every time I tried to end the conversation, he'd steer me back into some rambling monologue about the frat. His demeanor was unsettling, but I chalked it up to alcohol and awkwardness. Then the dizziness hit. The room spun, and the dim lighting seemed to grow darker. My vision blurred, and I felt my legs wobble. A creeping sense of panic set in as I realized something was wrong. The last thing I remembered was the man's smirk as he said, "You'll thank me later." When I came to, I was lying on a bed in a pitch-black room. My head pounded, and my mouth was dry. For a moment I couldn't tell where I was. The muffled thump of music filtered through the walls, reminding me I was still in the frat house. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, like I'd been sedated. Taking deep breaths, I forced myself to survey the room. It was small and sparsely furnished, a bed, a dresser, and a closet. The only light came from under the door, a faint glow barely illuminating the space. That's when I heard it. A faint, crinkling noise, like a plastic bag being stepped on. The sound came from the closet. Every hair on my body stood on end. Someone, or something, was in there with me. My heart raced as I debated my next move. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just the house settling, or a stray piece of trash shifting. But then the sound came again, louder this time, unmistakably deliberate. Adrenaline took over. I scrambled off the bed, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to get to the door. My hands fumbled with the knob, but I managed to fling it open and bolt down the stairs. The party was still in full swing, the crowd oblivious to what was happening upstairs. I spotted Mark across the room and shoved my way through the crowd to get to him. "We need to leave, now," I said, my voice trembling. Mark looked confused, but didn't argue. We pushed past a group of guys huddled by the door and burst outside into the cool night air. I didn't stop moving until we were in the car, speeding back toward campus. "What happened?" Mark asked, glancing at me nervously. I told him everything. The drink, the dizziness, waking up in the dark room, and the sound in the closet. His face went pale. "Should we call the cops?" he asked, his hand hovering over his phone. "No," I said quickly. "What would we even tell them? That I was drugged at a frat party? It's pointless." Mark hesitated, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you think were you?" He couldn't even finish the sentence, but I knew what he was asking. I didn't feel any pain, and my clothes were exactly as they had been. "I don't think so," I said, though the uncertainty gnawed at me. When we got back to the dorm, I checked the time. I'd only been unconscious for about 10 minutes. Whatever the guy gave me, it must not have worked the way he intended. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, replaying everything in my mind. The man's smirk, the plastic bag in the closet, the possibility of what could have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. I never went to another frat party after that, and I steered clear of Mark's rush events altogether. it remains the most terrifying experience of my life. A reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when you let your guard down. Even now, I can still hear the crinkling sound from that closet in my nightmares. And I'll never forget the feeling of running for my life, not knowing what or who might be behind me. During my 2 years at Binghamton University, I was lucky enough to fall into a tight-knit group of friends. We'd hang out together nearly every weekend, and though our plans usually involved parties or hitting the local bars, we sometimes opted for something quieter. One Friday night in October, our group didn't have any big plans, so it ended up being just me and 2 close friends, Jake and Ryan. Instead of staying in, we decided to head out to the university's nature preserve, a sprawling stretch of woods and trails behind campus. There was a spot we liked by the lake, a small clearing on the far side that felt like our little secret. The spot was perfect for fires, tucked far enough from campus and out of sight of school security. It wasn't a well-known location, and the only people who went out there were usually looking to do something they couldn't do on campus: smoke, drink, or indulge in other recreational activities. We didn't care much for that stuff. We just liked the solitude. That night, we brought along a couple of beers, lit a small fire, and settled in for what we jokingly called a bro chat. The air was crisp, but not too cold, the kind of night where the warmth of a fire felt perfect. Time slipped by as we drank, laughed, and let the stress of the week melt away. At some point, the conversation got so funny that Ryan ended up on the ground, rolling in the leaves, laughing uncontrollably. That's when Jake suddenly froze, cutting off his laughter with a sharp shh. We all stopped, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the distant hum of wind through the trees. Then we heard it, leaves crunching in the distance. My heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, we tossed our bottles into the lake. We were all underage, and though it was rare for campus police to patrol this deep into the woods, the possibility was enough to spike our paranoia. Jake quickly stuffed the rest of the beers into his backpack as the 3 of us sat in silence, ears tuned to the faint rustling. The sound was coming closer. We whispered nervously, speculating about who or what it could be. The spot was so remote that we'd never encountered anyone else there before. Maybe it was campus security or another group of students stumbling through the woods. But as the footsteps grew louder, we realized it didn't sound like multiple people. It sounded like just one. A sharp crack echoed through the clearing as a tree branch snapped nearby. I jumped, my breath hitching. The fire's glow made us easy targets, illuminating us like a beacon in the dark. We should have put it out, but none of us moved. The crunching grew louder, circling us. The pattern wasn't random. It felt deliberate, like someone was moving in a wide arc around our campsite, staying just out of sight. The atmosphere shifted, the kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl, like being watched. This is straight out of Asterisk, The Blair Witch Project, Jake whispered, trying to laugh but failing miserably. We forced nervous chuckles, but the tension was palpable. Every few seconds there was another sound, a branch snapping, leaves rustling, footsteps crunching closer. The fire suddenly felt too small, too vulnerable. Then, out of nowhere, a loud asterisk thud asterisk shattered the silence. I flinched, my eyes darting to the center of the clearing. A branch, thick and heavy, had landed right by the fire. It had been thrown. There was no mistaking that. Ryan didn't wait to find out who had thrown it. He bolted, disappearing into the woods without a word. Jake and I stayed frozen, staring at each other, half laughing out of disbelief, half paralyzed by fear. "Is this a joke?" he whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could answer, another branch came hurtling out of the darkness, striking Jake square in the face. He let out a yelp of pain, clutching his cheek. That was enough for me. I grabbed the backpack, pulled Jake to his feet, and we ran. The trail back to campus was a blur, our footsteps pounding against the dirt as we sprinted through the woods. My heart raced, adrenaline drowning out everything else. When we reached the road that separated the nature preserve from campus, we stopped to catch our breath. My lungs burned, and Jake was still holding his face, though he insisted he was fine. Then we heard it again. Footsteps, crunching leaves, getting closer. "Run!" I shouted, not waiting to see who or what it was. We didn't stop until we were back in our dorm building, slamming the door shut behind us. When we finally made it to Jake's room, we found Ryan already there, sitting on his bed, looking pale and shaken. "What happened?" I asked, but he just shook his head. The three of us peered out his window, which overlooked the edge of the woods. Down below, by the tree line, we saw a figure pacing back and forth. They moved erratically, pausing whenever a car drove by before retreating into the shadows. We watched in tense silence until finally the figure disappeared into the woods for good. Relief washed over us as we realized they were gone. Trying to shake off the fear, we cracked open the beers we'd salvaged and sat around talking, laughing nervously as we tried to process what had just happened. Within 10 minutes, we were joking about it, the adrenaline making everything seem less terrifying in hindsight. But the next morning, the humor was gone. In the light of day, the events of the previous night felt far more sinister. We couldn't explain what had happened, who had been out there, why they had circled us, or why they had thrown branches at us. The fact that they had followed us to the road only added to the unease. We made an unspoken pact that morning. No more trips to the nature preserve after dark. Whatever, or whoever, was out there, we didn't want to risk meeting them again. Looking back, that night remains one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. The woods, once a place of laughter and camaraderie, now felt tainted by something dark and unexplainable. Even now, I can't help but wonder about the figure pacing at the edge of the forest and what their intentions might have been. My sophomore year started off well enough. I had a single dorm room that semester, a rare luxury on campus. It was tucked away in the far corner of the floor, secluded from the other rooms. To get to my door, you had to turn a sharp corner, so it almost felt like its own private section. I loved it. I had the perfect balance of privacy and social life. I could hang out with friends when I wanted to, but retreat to my little hideaway whenever I needed peace. At least, that's how it was at first. A few weeks into the semester, as I was cramming for a bio exam late one night, the silence in my room was broken by a sound. It was faint, so quiet I almost didn't hear it at first, a light tapping on my door. It startled me, but I figured it was one of the other students on the floor. I called out, "Come in!" But the door didn't open. Curious, I got up and opened it myself. No one was there. Poking my head out, I looked down the hall. Nothing. The long, fluorescent-lit corridor was completely empty. Shrugging it off as a prank, I went back to my room and left the door slightly ajar, in case they came back. But no one did. The next night, I had just turned off my lamp and climbed into bed when the knocking returned. Only this time it wasn't a light tapping. It was louder, more deliberate. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. "Who is it?" I called out. No answer. I waited a moment before getting up and swinging the door open. Again, no one was there. Frustrated, I stepped out into my little corridor and quickly made my way to the corner that connected it to the main hallway. Still, no one. The next morning, I asked around. I figured someone on the floor was messing with me, maybe trying to get a laugh out of scaring me. But everyone I talked to swore they weren't involved. They seemed genuinely confused when I brought it up. That should have been the end of it. But the next night, it escalated. I had fallen asleep around midnight, but at some point in the early hours, the knocking started again. It jolted me awake, louder than ever. This time, it was relentless. It didn't stop after a few seconds. It kept going. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I ignore it, yell out, open the door again? Finally, summoning some courage, I jumped out of bed and flung the door open. As I expected, the corridor was empty. But this time, something was different. As I glanced toward the main hallway, I caught a glimpse of someone, a figure dressed in dark clothing, turning the far corner at the other end of the hall. Without thinking, I sprinted after them, adrenaline surging through my veins. I reached the corner and turned, just in time to see the door to the communal bathroom at the end of the hallway shutting. I hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. It slammed against the wall with a loud bang. The bathroom was dark. Fumbling for the light switch, I flicked it on, expecting to find someone hiding inside. But the room appeared empty. Still, I wasn't convinced. My eyes darted to the two bathroom stalls, both of which were closed. Slowly, I crouched down and peered under the doors. That's when I saw them. A pair of heavy black boots, visible beneath one of the stall doors. My heart nearly stopped. Taking a deep breath, I stood up and forced the stall door open. It was empty. The boots were there, sitting on the floor, but there was no one wearing them. And then I heard it. A low, guttural giggle echoed through the bathroom, sending chills racing up my spine. It wasn't a child's laugh or even a high-pitched giggle. It was deep, raspy, and unhinged, the kind of laugh that makes your blood run cold. Suddenly, all my courage evaporated. I bolted out of the bathroom and ran back to my room as fast as I could. Slamming the door shut behind me, I jumped into bed, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone. I tried texting every friend I could think of, desperate for someone to respond, but it was the middle of the night. Everyone was asleep. I stayed awake for hours, heart pounding, listening for any sound. At one point, the knocking returned, slow and deliberate, as if taunting me. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I didn't even breathe until it finally stopped. The next day, I brought it up again with the others on my floor. No one had heard the knocking, and everyone swore once again that they weren't pranking me. I watched their faces closely, looking for any hint of a lie, but they all seemed genuinely puzzled. That was the last night the knocking happened, but the experience stayed with me. Whoever or whatever was behind it had clearly chosen to target me, specifically. I couldn't stop thinking about those boots in the bathroom stall or the laughter I'd heard. It wasn't a prank. I was sure of that. And the thought that someone, an older man, judging by the boots, had been in the dorm, tormenting me, still sends shivers down my spine. Even now, I can't explain what happened, and maybe I never will. This version builds tension gradually, adding vivid descriptions and emotional depth to pull readers into the narrator's experience. Let me know if you'd like more adjustments.